Hey guys, welcome to a video lecture on the Enlightenment. Alright, take notes on the notes that I provided for you. If you have any questions, I should be circulating around here somewhere. The scientific revolution was a time period in which logic, reason, and the scientific method started to challenge traditional beliefs held by institutions such as the church. With the scientific method, and you've probably done this in science class, you had to have a hypothesis as to what kind of problem you were trying to solve. You had to have evidence to support your conclusions, and then if you were going to make a conclusion, it had to be based on that evidence. It couldn't be anything that you just thought of. This flew right in the face of religion, because religion is based on faith, which is a belief, but you can't necessarily prove. That's why science and religion are going to kind of come to blows during this time period, and still, to some extent, happen today. What is the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is a cultural and intellectual movement in which philosophers, or we're going to call them philosophes, tried to shape society in the mold of reason and rational thought, as opposed to tradition and old-time values that have been held for so long. I hesitate to say that the Enlightenment was anti-religion, because it wasn't. Some philosophes were anti-religion, but not all of them were. The Enlightenment doesn't spit in the face of religion necessarily, but it does challenge it. Let's talk about Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who basically didn't like people. He thought people were evil. And he writes all about it in this book, Leviathan. Leviathan has a few main points that you should know. Number one, people are evil and they need to be controlled. Thomas Hobbes thought government's sole purpose was to keep people in line. If you don't, you'll have chaos. And he bases this on human nature, which he believes to be corrupt and evil. Hobbes believed that if you were going to have any kind of government, you needed to have a powerful and ruthless monarch in order to have any sort of order and structure in society. Any government of the people, democracy, republic, that just allows humans to corrupt it. And again, Hobbes thinks people are evil, so he doesn't believe in democracy. Even though Hobbes believed in a monarchy, he rejected the divine right of kings we've been talking about. The divine right of kings, just as a reminder, was the belief that a monarch got their power from God. Thomas Hobbes didn't believe that at all. He, if anything, probably didn't believe in God, but he did believe that kings should have unlimited power, whether it came from God or not. He disagreed with the divine right of kings. One major thing about Hobbes that you should remember: his belief about government and society can sort of be summed up in one sentence. People give up their freedom in exchange for order. Write that down. People give up their freedom in exchange for order. Now, what does that mean? Well, think about if you've ever been to the airport. When you go to the airport, you have to put your bag on the conveyor belt, you have to take off your shoes, you have to walk through a machine to make sure that you're not carrying any weapons on you. Now, that is technically an invasion of your privacy, but nobody really makes a fuss about this because everybody wants to be safe. So this exemplifies what Thomas Hobbes said. People give up their freedom, being searched and going through security at the airport, in exchange for order. We don't want somebody attacking us on a plane or blowing up the plane or blowing up the airport. That's why we give up our freedom. This sums Thomas Hobbes up. Thomas Hobbes believed that you, as the individual, only have the rights that the state gives you. You don't have rights that are given to you by God or society. You have the rights that the government gives you and nothing else. According to Thomas Hobbes, the state, the government, the nation, that is more important than the individual and the individual's interests and rights. But Thomas Hobbes' opposite, or nemesis, or doppelganger, was John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher who believed that government's sole role is to protect the individual's life, liberty, and property. You should write that down. Life, liberty, and property. That's all the government is supposed to do, according to John Locke. John Locke believes that people are good and that the government should protect them instead of inhibit them or try to restrict them. As opposed to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke thought individual rights and liberty are more important than the state or the government. And all of John Locke's ideas, that he writes in several works, most important being two treatises of government. Most of Locke's ideas are going to be the basis for our nation's values and ideas, most importantly the Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers claim that Americans had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, property, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Gee, I wonder where Thomas Jefferson got this idea from. Now, Locke also believed that there was a social contract between the government and the people. But Locke believed that that social contract should be designed by the people, and that the government should have no authority that wasn't given to the government without the people's consent. All right, so let's talk about everyone's favorite Scot, David Hume. Now, David Hume was a little bit more like René Descartes, who we've been talking about in class. David Hume believed that human desire, governs people's behavior, not reason. Descartes believed that reason made people do what they wanted, whereas David Hume believed it was desire and emotion that made people do what they wanted to do. David Hume said there's no such thing as innate ideas, meaning ideas that are just inside you naturally or from birth. David Hume believed that any ideas you had came from direct experience or from education. That's how you were able to come up with ideas. There aren't just people, according to David Hume, that just have ideas that haven't been unearthed yet. The idea of innate ideas was an idea that the church had had for hundreds of years, but Hume believed this wasn't true. David Hume also pontificated about free will. He thought about whether man had free will or if everything was determined, and we've talked about this a little bit in class. David Hume thoroughly believed that man had free will and they did things on their own design. He was against determinism. Remember, determinism is like fate. Everything that happens has already been planned and determined. David Hume says, I don't agree. Man has free will. All right, let's talk about Denis Diderot. Denis Diderot, in a lot of ways, was the creator of Wikipedia. Not actually Wikipedia. Denis Diderot is the co-creator of the Encyclopedia. Now, the Encyclopedia is a series of books that detail many different subjects and disciplines. So before the internet, before Wikipedia, if you wanted to know some general information about the platypus, about dinosaurs, about surface runoff, about water preservation, about water purification, whatever the subject was, you would look in an encyclopedia. So why do we include Diderot in with the rest of these philosophers? Well, philosophers originally were writing their ideas in encyclopedias. So the encyclopedia evolved from a bunch of philosophical ideas into how we know it today, which is almost like a dictionary of subjects and information. Let's talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very similar to John Locke, or at least he was. He's dead now. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed in the social contract. Just like John Locke, he believed that there should be an agreement between the government and the people. But he really furthered this idea. He believed that in the social contract, private property needed to be respected by the government. There were certain things that the government could not touch in regards to the social contract, private property being one. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is probably the ultimate catalyst for the French Revolution. His ideas really are popular with the Third Estate in France and sparks the French Revolution in 1783. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is also the pioneer of what's known as the modern autobiography. An autobiography is when somebody writes a biography on themselves. Somebody else doesn't write it. So let's talk about Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu, his big contribution was the idea of separation of powers. Now we have that in our federal government and our state governments and our local governments. Basically, the idea of a monarch was something Montesquieu did not favor. He thought that put power in just one person and that was dangerous. So instead, Montesquieu thought about the idea of separating power. Our three branches of government in the United States are an example of this. You have the executive branch, which is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, and the judicial branch, which is all the court systems. Rousseau's idea of separation of power has influenced many constitutions around the world, not just the United States, and it comes out of that fear of absolute rule. Montesquieu really pontificates on this idea after the English Bill of Rights and the English Civil War, in which the English limit the power of William and Mary, the future monarchs. This idea of separating power between the monarchs and the people was a much more attractive form of democracy to people all around the world. So Montesquieu's big contribution is separation of powers. Let's talk about Voltaire. Voltaire is one of the most popular philosophers of all time. Here's some of his major ideas. Voltaire believed in freedom of expression. Today you might call that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to peacefully assemble. All of that comes from Voltaire's beliefs that the individual has the right to express themselves, and so do groups, as long as it's done peacefully. So Voltaire's big idea was separation of church and state. The government and the state need to be separate from each other. You cannot have a government that is also run by a religious group, because that limits people's expression. They have to be that religion that the government says that they have to be. This idea of separation of church and state we have in our country today. We have a secular society, a society in which you can practice religion, but it's not governed by religion. A non-secular society is a religious society. Whatever religion that society wants to be, you have to be part of that. So we are a secular society. Make sure you know that. Voltaire also believed in trial by jury. You could not just be arrested and thrown in jail. You had the right to face your accusers. You had the right to be judged by a jury of your peers. That we also have borrowed here in the United States. But what Voltaire was most outspoken about was he was a critic of organized religion. He thought organized religion was dangerous. He had no problem with spirituality. If you had your own personal beliefs, that was fine. But Voltaire criticized religion for many wars that we had throughout history due to religious conflict. He thought organized religion was the bane of society. It wasn't good. It only caused conflict. He would constantly attack the Catholic Church throughout his lifetime and in his writings. Finally, we're going to end with Francis Bacon, who you learned a little bit about in the video the other day. Francis Bacon was an early advocate of the scientific method. He would die in the early 1500s, so when he's talking about the scientific method, many people still thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. So they weren't willing to accept this new experiment-driven model. But Bacon's adherence to the scientific method would lead to a revolution of how we investigated nature. We started to, through this skepticism, question everything. Bacon was the first scientist ever to be knighted in England. Bacon famously dies while he's testing the preservation of meat while trying to freeze it. It's a little odd that a guy named Bacon dies for trying to preserve meat, but whatever. So why are we learning about the Enlightenment? What is the point? Well, the point is that all of these philosophers were helping to shape society with their philosophies. Because of this, many governments throughout the world changed their constitutions, changed their laws, changed the way they operated so that people had more say in government, had their rights respected. So here's the deal. What I want you to do is look through all of these philosophers and make sure that you understand their philosophies, their views on government, their views on nature, religion. Hope you enjoyed this video lecture. I'll see you later.